Tonight on Community Connections, I'm talking with Tony MacDonald, who's the head of the Urban Coast Institute at Monmouth University. I have with me tonight Tony MacDonald, the head of the executive director, to be specific, of the Urban Coast Institute here at Monmouth University. Thanks for coming over.
Great. Thank you very much.
Two things I want to ask. One is, tell us what the Urban Coast Institute is, because my guess is most people who watch the show in Long Branch don't know. They know there's a coast. They know Monmouth University is at least part in Long Branch, so it's in a coastal community. And you were also just involved in the major international conference on climate change.
Yep.
And played a big role.
Yep, thank you, appreciate it. I don't know how big the role is, but it's really good to be involved, but thanks for the opportunity. I think, again, I know you've been mayor for a long time, and I think everybody in your community does know that what they do, everybody who lives here has a great relationship with the coastal and marine environment. So the Urban Coast Institute was started at Monmouth 10 years ago, 2005, and it was really formed because the university recognized that we had a special responsibility being a neighbor of West Long Branch and also working with the communities. So we were formed really to be looking at sort of relationships between people and the environment. How do we live right at the shore? How do we protect the things we love for the future? So the Urban Coast Institute really looks at a variety of different things, but really our job is to actually use science to inform policy decisions. So we have the right laws in place to protect the environment, to reduce nutrient pollution. Are we actually managing ocean resources? You probably remember the days where we'd had ocean dumping.
Sure.
So that's been closed now, but there's a lot of other activities proposed offshore New Jersey, like wind energy.
Natural gas.
Exactly, natural gas. So there's a lot of other issues that are in play. So we try to bring sort of some attention to those issues, try to do some research around water quality issues. We do a lot of work, even before Sandy, with community resilience. So we're very interested in also looking at how, we both have the legal processes, but also we work at issues. So we have a staff person who specifically works on community resilience issues, and we also are looking at ocean planning issues for sort of the larger ocean.
Give me an example, ocean planning issues. Now I know that just along the North Jersey coast, from a little bit south of Long Branch to the Hook, we've had proposed wind farms. We've had, again, vetoed a liquid natural gas outfall, whatever they want to call it. It's been vetoed again. I think this time, first it was Governor Christie, then it was Governor Cuomo vetoed it. It's not going to anywhere right now. But these are huge issues that impact Long Branch and the coastal towns.
Well, specifically right now we actually have a grant from the Moore Foundation to actually develop a spatial planning platform for the Mid-Atlantic from Virginia up to New York. So we're actually working with other partners. Spatial planning. So we are gathering GIS, Geographic Information System. So again, we're trying to bring the best science to inform decisions. So right now there's actually an executive order that Obama administration to encourage states to get together and develop regional ocean plans. So jointly, all the states in the region are interested and may be impacted. If there's oil and gas drilling off of Virginia, New Jersey might care about that. So we are trying to work in this region to do two things. There's a process underway to develop a regional ocean action plan, which is being developed by the federal and state agencies. And Monmouth the Urban Coast Institute has a grant from the Moore Foundation to actually gather all of the data, spatial data about where the potentially wind farms might go. Where are the critical environmental areas? So where the ecosystem benefits, where are the fisheries areas? Where is the navigation channels? So we are actually gathering that into
map.
It's a map, but it's a searchable map. So everybody in your community, if they search for the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal, they can use it. We're making it so that anybody can have access, not only the planning and the federal agencies, but the communities can actually access all of the available data.
And what would they be able to do with it?
Well, you can do anything. So let's say you have an issue, you have a question. Let's say you're talking about the site where the liquid natural gas facility might have been put.
Okay.
You actually could pull up on this portal what is happening in that activity right now. Is it a critical ecological area? Is it a fishing area? Is there also a wind farm proposed? I mean, one of the reasons that I think it was as I understand it, the governors objected to it was it's has potential conflicts with navigation, and obviously port navigation is very important to this region. So there's a conflict with navigation. There was a concern about whether there's a conflict for a potential wind farm that might be sited out there in the future, in addition to their environmental concerns. So you could use this portal to actually spatially look at what the activities are out there and find out sort of how those conflicts might arise in the future and how you might try to resolve them earlier in the process.
You're coming at this more from a policy point of view than a scientific point of view. Would that be accurate?
Very much. I think the mission for the Urban Coast Institute is to impact policy. Again, I'm a lawyer. I was trained as a lawyer. I worked in Washington, D.C. for 18 years on marine and coastal policy issues. And so really what I try to do is gather science to inform policy. So really, how can we bring science to the table to do that? So we work with a lot of partners. We work a lot with folks at Stevens Institute. They do some wonderful work on coastal engineering and coastal processes issues. So we work with them a lot about beach nourishment projects. So I have some work underway currently with the Corps of Engineers to be looking at sort of the future of beach nourishment projects.
What I call sand restoration.
Sand restoration. Well, do we have the sand in the future to do that? I mean, we've been doing this for a long time, and what are the costs going to be? So the Corps of Engineers is looking at sort of how do they stay in the business of sand management? Is that going to be
So you're like their study arm right now.
So we're the study arm. We try to do some of that research. We also do a lot of convening. So another thing we do is we try to bring together perspectives. We're an academic institution, so we like to think that we really can respectively bring two sides together to discuss an issue. So we bring communities together sometimes to discuss
When you
conflicts.
say two sides and conflicts, could you give me an example of that?
Well, I think some of the issues that we have looked at in the past is really to be thinking about, for example, one issue that we're looking at maybe getting involved with in the future is things about noise in the ocean. There's a lot of concern about that. So we're looking at whether or not we might sort of bring some of the scientists who understand sort of what the impacts of the noise might be together to discuss that.
Who's for it and who's against it?
Well, again, that's when you get into politics. So I'm not an advocacy group. So in some cases, there are a lot of groups right now
Fishermen
might be concerned about the impact on fish, but researchers might say this is very important for us to understand sort of what the nature of the ocean is for us to do some studies. They might say that. The oil and gas industry or the energy industry might say we need to know, even if we're not going to exploit that oil and gas, we should know what's down there so that we can plan for the future in the event we do that. Now, in the Mid-Atlantic, there's a pretty much a political consensus. Doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat. In this region, there's a pretty strong consensus against oil and gas drilling in the region. But again, there is some interest in that. And right now, even the Obama administration is looking at oil and gas drilling in the South Atlantic. So we're even concerned
it's currently on the table, and I don't think the president's come out against it.
No, he hasn't, and even the governors in Virginia have not come out against it. Particularly natural gas might be something that they might be interested in.
They might mine it, or they're thinking about it. You were invited, and the Institute played I'll call it a significant role. I think I called it a big role. But you played a role in the climate change conference in Paris.
Well, we have been working for a while, and I have been working with a coalition of groups. So there's something called the Global Forum for Coasts, Islands, and Ocean Affairs. So we've been trying to actually get oceans onto the agenda of the climate agenda. Traditionally, when you talk about climate, you talk about weather patterns, meteorology. There's a lot of discussion about forest conservation. But most people don't recognize the significant role that oceans play in regulating
temperature.
Climate. They regulate temperature, they absorb carbon. If they absorb too much carbon, they get something called ocean acidification. So the pH factor goes up. And that actually throws off the ecology. So we're very concerned about the impacts of too much carbon in the atmosphere that disrupts this carbon cycle. So the ocean is very important to temperature. It regulates carbon. The impacts, certainly we talk a lot about in New Jersey, not only about ocean acidification and changing in ecosystems, but obviously sea level rise. That's a huge issue in the climate environment. So a lot of the discussions over there were about adaptation to climate change.
Now, you're not a scientist.
I am not.
But is there any serious debate about the science of climate change in your mind?
I think there is always, anybody who has this debate, it doesn't need a majority. So there is not a lot of debate in terms of the percentage. In terms of the international climate, particularly if you're over there, it's pretty clear that humans have a significant impact and have been adding to the carbon equation. So there's no doubt about that. I think that really the debate comes in about what is the response to that. There's a concern about the fact is there's so much carbon in the atmosphere, you can't reverse that. That some of the climate change and some of the temperature increases are baked in because we've already
We've gone too far.
requirements. So I don't think there's any debate that humans have had the impact. If there is any debate, it's about how we would respond to that. And there's a concern that it's mostly political and economic. What is the response to that? Can we afford to mitigate that? And can we really afford to go to renewables? That really is the debate. So I don't think the science and the impact on climate is debatable. But how to respond to that and what are the economic implications of that, I think, are really where people
Now,
do.
what role is the Institute going to play in that? I mean, there were agreements reached in Paris that seem to give everybody a sense of optimism that things can still change. Would you agree with that?
I would say it's heading in that direction. This is an international agreement. There's 195 countries at the table. It is a consensus agreement. There's a little bit of a lowest common denominator element of agreement, but it's fundamentally different than anything we've ever seen before on climate change. So I think they agreed to a couple of very important things. It sends a lot of messages to not only the business community, but also the government communities. So there's a consensus. They agreed that they want to not only have a goal of less than 2 degrees centigrade increase. So that has significant implications for mitigation and reducing carbon emissions. They set a new aspirational goal for 1.5. Most people know that the plans that we currently have in place aren't going to even get us there. Most predictions are, even under current projections and commitments, it's probably going to increase 3.6 to 4 degrees centigrade.
In how many years?
Significant impacts. Somewhere between, in the next 50 to 100 years. It's easier to predict the amount. It's a little more difficult. Again, I'm not a scientist, but I work with a lot of scientists, and they say it's a lot harder to predict when that's going to happen, but they're pretty confident that their models that there will be a significant increase. So Paris, I think, did 3 significant things. It committed nations internationally to essentially move toward renewable energy sources. So really, there is a question about whether we can increase the technology to move toward renewable sources. And there is a question, again, this will be a question not only for governments, but for markets, about whether we will move off of a carbon-based economy to a non-carbon-based economy. But that will depend on a lot of actions. A lot of the agreement in Paris said we are going to commit to future actions. So it really will be how they stand up to what they call about these nationally determined commitments and how they revise those over the next 5 years.
And that'll be China, it'll be the United States, it'll be Russia.
Well, and India is a big player.
India.
There's a lot of players, and so there's 2 sides of this. One is, if you've been following this, there was a lot of progress made going into Paris. For China and the US to get together and have some bilateral agreements, it was fundamentally changed that, in fact, the developing countries like China and India, which have a large demand for raising poverty, so they feel that the US and some of the industrialized nations have already developed their economies, sort of exploiting carbon. So they feel that they need some time to catch up from an economic perspective. But they have agreed, and this is a fundamental shift, that they're going to decrease the amount of carbon more quickly than they had originally, and they will move toward actually implementing new technologies to move more quickly away from that. So you've broken down this kind of divide between the developed world and the developing world. There's a recognition that everybody has some commitment to make to implement solutions.
Isn't that in and of itself a huge deal?
Yes, it's a huge deal. And that's what I'm saying. Sometimes it's as important, particularly in international agreements, to actually come at it from a different philosophy. So it's completely switched the paradigm on its head. The other thing that it's done, which is really significant, a lot of the leadership in Paris was actually by the small island developing states, and the states that are most at risk from sea level rise. I mean, there are entire countries that really within 2 lifetimes are threatening to be extinguished. So there's also a lot of agreement that the developed world did need to stand up with financial commitments for capacity building, for technology development. And again, as I said, I think what has changed a lot over the last 5 or 10 years is how quickly some of the alternative technologies, the battery powers, the exploitation of hydrogen. So I think people are much more hopeful that with greater investment, and one of the first big announcements was Bill Gates in the first days, who announced a private sector commitment to technology development.
All right.
So I think involving that, I think, is very important.
Okay, let's take a break and then we'll come back for the second half.
Your seat cushion can be used to grant wishes.
Who said that? Hello?
Really can, you know.
You talking to me?
Sure am. Because the airline miles you earn and donate to Make-A-Wish can help send thousands of kids on their wish trips. So donate to Make-A-Wish today.
You really should, you know. You really should.
And give wishes wings, because wishes work wonders.
back with the second half of Community Connections with Tony MacDonald from the Urban Coast Institute here at Monmouth University. Sea level rise. It's a scary thought. I mean, you know, in Long Branch, if it comes up a foot or two, it's a problem. There are places where it's already starting to happen, though.
Absolutely, and I think it's sea level rise itself usually isn't that scary to people, but if you combine it with storms, that's when it gets very scary. And there's two things. We're doing some work at Monmouth with a coalition of other groups, which are developing we're working with Rutgers, we're working with Sustainable Jersey and other groups to actually develop mapping tools for communities to be able to predict the impacts that are various different sea level rise scenarios of different storms on their communities. So we really think that we're hopefully enabling communities to look at sort of longer term planning of these issues. But it's not only storms. So you have the high impact storms, which certainly Sandy is a big storm. So how do we respond to that? But it's also nuisance flooding. I mean, you're finding in more communities, Seabright and others, that actually just a little bit of high tide, you're having more flooding as a regular basis. So that can disrupt operations. We built in lowlands. We have our sewage treatment plants often in places that are, you know, what happens if some of those back up in terms of the pipes and their ability to do that. A lot of the flooding happened in New Jersey, not only from the beaches, but in the back bays. Our back bay areas, we have no plan whatsoever to invest in the back bays for that. So we really have a lot of issues to do that. So we're trying to figure out how do you match sort of, we don't want to, we want to see this is a scenario. How do you not only mitigate those impacts, but how can you adapt to them?
Now, there are places where that impact is going to be worse than others. I mean, Sandy, you mentioned Seabright, devastating. Long Branch, serious damage, but not as bad.
Right.
I mean, we have a bluff along the
You sit
ocean
high.
front.
You probably don't, most people don't realize that, but you sit very high relative to other areas in New Jersey.
And there were parts where it came pouring in because it wasn't as high, and the bay flooded.
Right.
The water came in from more than one angle.
Right.
But there are spots like in southern Florida where they're having problems now.
Right.
And they have nuclear plants in the way of some of these flooding.
So I think there's a whole variety of issues, and I think certainly you're going to see some difference not only in essentially planning, because local governments can't do it all. There's a lot of other incentives for people to build in communities. So we get 30-year mortgages. We don't get 100-year mortgages. So the investment mechanisms are sort of on a short time frame. So really, they're not really looking at, maybe we're going to be looking about whether or not we really should be financing some of this development over time because of sea level rise impacts. The insurance industry, I think, is looking very differently at insurance products.
I've never figured out why we rebuild in places that flood over and over and over again.
Well, you know, I think part of it is it's a common sense solution. Our tax base. I mean, how does a municipality agree not to build when you're?
I'm guilty of it.
How do you pay? How do you pay for your school systems?
Right.
Your municipal tax structure depends on you bringing in a certain amount of revenues, and you don't have the flexibility of the state in some regards.
Well, I've also developed along the ocean front, and I wonder, you know, if 20, 30, 40 years, where the water's going to be.
Well, again, maybe
we're up high.
So you can only do so much. You can only do so much to control nature. You can do a little bit more to control people or to work with people, maybe.
Interesting way to put it.
But I think part of the issue is how do we create an incentive for a mayor like you to say, you know what, we don't have to develop. Maybe there's value in open space. Like, how do you create some value in you creating a buffer for your communities?
Well, we actually did that in the redevelopment zone. I mean, one of the things I will never forget the feeling as I was driving towards the redevelopment zone on the Tuesday morning after Sandy, and there was minimal damage when we got down there because we prepared, you know, we built according to certain standards. On the other hand, there are spots that they don't have that option.
Well, certainly we have, we can build newer and better. And I think to some extent, it's unfortunate that we have rebuilt as much as we have on the shore, but we've rebuilt better. Most of the new buildings are higher. They're built to stronger standards. We can do a lot with building standards to protect people and property. But whether that will withstand it for 50 or 100 years, I'm not as clear. So I wonder, how do we create both the financial mechanisms for towns to be able to actually retreat from the shoreline, if they can, but also create some value for the communities? How do you create value in the school system? How do you create value in open space? We do a lot in New Jersey for green space and farmlands. We have things called transfer development rights, where we allow communities to value the open space and get the value for that by transferring the development rights somewhere else. How do we create new kind of financial mechanisms so you can create value along your shoreline to protect those areas?
Well, I'm going to tell you, one of the things is they have to involve the communities in their planning.
Absolutely.
And they've got to start thinking in terms of we have a flawed tax system in New Jersey where we base it on property taxes.
Yep.
And even if you pack every square inch with development, that doesn't lower, I mean, that's not the way to lower your property taxes.
Right.
But they've got to start doing this at the state level. I mean, one of the things, you got into this business working for the Koch administration.
Right.
One of the things that one of his, not his immediate successor, but one of the things that Mike Bloomberg did, he brought people in to do environmental planning.
He did, and actually New York City did one of the best jobs in actually developing a long-term plan. They really have developed a plan, a long-term plan for investment in New York City for infrastructure, for investment. But again, they have access to more resources than some of the small communities.
Mike Bloomberg actually paid for some of it out of his own pocket.
But also, and the Rockefeller
He has more money than I do.
You think? The Rockefeller Foundation also supported a lot of that study work, and others did. But also, the city has bonding authority. They can actually have access to capital money to do things, and I think that's not.
And some of it was just the planning that they did.
But they did very extensive planning, and in New York State, they did a little bit more than New Jersey. New Jersey's done some with regard to buyouts, using some of the Sandy recovery money to do some buyouts, mostly up north in some of the flooded areas. Because this is not just in New Jersey a shorefront area.
No, it's not.
It's very much, we're a peninsula, really. We're a watershed. We have a lot of flooding, and we have to worry just as much, if not more, in New Jersey about river flooding and bay flooding, because the reality is most of our storms are heavy rainstorms, and they're not driven by storm surge.
Well, one of the worst flooding spots in New Jersey are the rivers in North Jersey.
Absolutely.
And you're built in the watershed area.
Absolutely. And so, again, I don't know how we think. I sometimes you hear the kind of line that in New Jersey's built out, but it's only built out relative to what the current land use patterns are, and there's what the current regulations are in terms of development. But we have ways to develop very differently. That's what I think is going to change. I do think insurance companies, I think planners, it has to be over time. That's another thing. This is a long-term problem. It's going to take a long-term solution. How do we stepwise help communities to do the right thing and to make the kind of changes that your kids and grandkids will be able to come to the shore?
Do you think it's we're in the beginning stages of a presidential campaign where one party is just pretending this problem is non-existent? They've ignored what went on in Paris. You think it's possible to make change if the president, if there's a Republican president who says climate change isn't our problem? What do you think happens?
Well, I think there's a couple of issues at play. First of all, I'm going to say it was very interesting to be over in Paris and see the level of dialogue and the amount of people who are committed to making the kind of social change and economic change and environmental change necessary to address the reality of climate. It does not seem to be part of our politics. It's just not even a debate. Over there. And I think the nature of the debate here is very driven by the same kind of narrow kind of issue politics that is driving a lot of our political dialogue in the U.S. So I do think that political statements like "I'm not a scientist" to avoid giving an answer. You as a politician know you need to make decisions every day that involve science, that involve economics, that involve science. And I don't think you're a PhD in economics, or maybe you are. The job of a politician is to gather that information and make those kind of judgments. So I think right now
my job is to talk to scientists.
And that's my job, to talk to science and say, how can I use that to inform policy? So I think right now it's very much driven by a very narrow political agenda. And right now, they don't see any upside to do that. Most of the polling, and we're doing some work with our polling institute, we have a great polling institute here, to try to look at what people's opinions are about things like sea level rise. So we're working on some work right now, and I think we're going to find some preliminary results so that the vast majority of the people do think that there is climate change, there is sea level rise, it is going to impact their lives, and they're basing it based on science and also, as you said, experience.
What was it like in Paris? Not just in terms of working, but you were there, it was shortly after one of the worst terrorist attacks imaginable.
It was fascinating to be there, and I've been to Paris before. It was fascinating because, again, in the political environment, some of the Republicans saying that it's a war zone over there, and their threats. Life is going on just the way it has. I mean, it has a very street culture. It has thing. So, but very much security is apparent, so it's clearer. But there's a clear sense of national identity, about their way of life, that's very important for them to be able to maintain. So you got that feeling, and you could see it meeting with some streets. My niece is studying over there right now. She was there during the event, and she said that they responded very quickly, that they felt that they were safe, and that they are now very much, recapturing the streets. So that was an issue. The other issue is the President Hollande really, to a large extent, people don't think of climate as a security issue. And it is a security issue, because not only do you have sea level rise and impacts on the communities that you can visualize here at the Jersey Shore, but you're going to have heat waves, droughts, you're going to have impacts, you're going to have climate refugees. The refugee issue, we're now responding to a very specific issue and tragedy of refugees, but you're going to have food crises, you're going to have other issues. So climate is very much recognized as a security issue. That has not really sort of, I think, gotten into the U.S. political debate. In fact, I was fortunate to work with Admiral Gaffney, who was the former president of Monmouth. He's currently a fellow at UCI, and he worked on a panel. He's an admiral, and he worked on the panel, I think, 10 years ago, that recognized that this was going to be a significant security issue. So no matter what you felt about, climate change, the reality was it was changing. Something was changing, and we know that. And the patterns are clear, and we better adapt, and we better anticipate that broadly for how it might impact.
Last question. We have about a minute. You optimistic?
I am, I think, hopeful as opposed to optimistic, and I say that, I use that word kind of considerably, because I do feel like when you see changes like in Paris, of change in phenomena, you don't have to agree with all of the science.
Can't.
But you do see society getting together as a group. When's the last time the UN has done, people can point to sort of an action, affirmative action. You looked around the room, you had people from Iran and Afghanistan, the small island developed states, so people who are fighting, who are in reaching a consensus. I'm very hopeful about a situation like that. I'm also very hopeful, I do have a lot of faith in science, and I do have a lot of faith in technology. We might not be able to hold on to everything we like about exactly what, it's not like, the future's not going to look like the past, but I think a lot of the same qualities will be there.
Thank you very much for coming over.
Great. Thanks. Appreciate it.